Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 32, Cameroon. So I wasn't able to get any Cameroonian drinks for today's episode, so I decided instead to create a Cameroonian-style tomato stew. The stew had a lot of ingredients, but importantly there was tomatoes, not a big shock there, onions, celery, lots of spices, and beef. There were a lot of moving parts to make the dish itself, but it was really good. The meat was cooked well, the texture of the stew itself was nice, and overall, just a good meal to have. You'll definitely want to have some rice on the side just to absorb some of the stew, but honestly, it's probably the best meal I've made for the show. This meal comes from the Republic of Cameroon, a country that's sort of in the intermediary zone between West Africa, the Sahel, and Central Africa. It has Chad and the Central African Republic to the east, the Republic of the Congo, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea to the south, the Atlantic Ocean to the southwest, Nigeria to the west, and the last remaining bits of Lake Chad in the northwest. Cameroon being located at the crossroads of several different African regions means it is geographically diverse. In the far north you have hot deserts, and then going south you have savannas. In the middle of the country you have mountains and hills, particularly in the northwestern parts of the country, and then south from there you have jungles and rainforest, which eventually go into the coastal regions. Overall, the country is quite tropical, with the exception of the northern areas where it's much more arid and desert-like. Cameroon has around 26.5 million people in it, divided between roughly 250 or so different ethnic groups. Now normally, even in African countries, which are quite diverse, there usually is at least a group that makes up over one-third of the country, and can be seen as somewhat dominant. However, no group in Cameroon makes up one-third of the population, with seemingly the largest, the Bamileke, making up less than 25% according to Wikipedia. So I would say the main important thing to know about Cameroon ethnically is that it is very diverse, and most people groups are Bantu in origin. Also, Cameroon is believed to be the original homeland for the various Bantu people groups found throughout Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. Language-wise, it is also very diverse, with many ethnic groups speaking their own language. However, most people in the country will speak French and/or English. Spoiler alert for later in the episode, but these two languages are spoken in the areas that were colonized by the French and English respectively. Around 20% live in the Anglophone-speaking Northwest, while the rest of the country is largely Francophone. Officially, Cameroon is bilingual, with both languages equally respected and used. But as you will find out later on, that's not really the case. German is also sometimes spoken. It's pretty rare for everyday life, but it apparently for an African country has a very large German-speaking community. And then in the north, Arabic or Fulani are commonly used as the language of trade and inter-ethnic communication. The majority of people in the country are Christians. Catholicism is the most practiced denomination, with almost 2/5 of the country being Catholic. There are also several large and important Protestant denominations in the country, such as Baptists, Pentecostals, and Evangelicals. Protestants tend to be concentrated in the Anglophone regions, while Catholicism is more dominant in the south and center of the country. There is also a large Islamic community in the north, with 20 to 25% being Muslim, mostly Sunni Muslim. There are also smaller groups of traditional African religions, Orthodox Christians, Baha'is, Hindus, and atheists. Cameroon seemingly was first settled by the African Pygmies, or as they call themselves, the Baka. The Baka, like the Twa in Burundi, were hunter-gatherers. Their way of life would be upended, and they would be forced to move to the southeastern parts of the country when the various Bantu peoples began expanding out of the Cameroonian highlands around 1000 CE. Since Cameroon is divided between many different people groups, it's really hard to craft a national history in pre-colonial times. It seems the northern parts of the country had most of the large civilizations and city-states. There were the Sao, the Kotaku, the Bornu Empire, and the Mandera Kingdom throughout the years. Islam would be brought to Cameroon starting in the 8th century, although it struggled to penetrate deep inland. The southern parts did have some small city-states and kingdoms, but they weren't nearly as powerful or as large as their northern neighbors, it seems. The first Europeans would arrive in the region in the 15th century. The Portuguese were the first, and were followed by the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, the English, the Swedes, and the Danes. None of these groups established large settlements in the country, but they did build a couple of small forts and trading points. They were mostly to take slaves out of the country to work on plantations in the New World. This would die down and eventually disappear in the 19th century. Some Europeans began building missions to convert the natives, and the English slowly began creeping into the region by the 1870s. However, it would be the Germans who first colonized Cameroon in 1884. They began moving into Cameroon hoping it could be a starting point of an ambitious German colonial empire that would stretch from the Atlantic Ocean and Central Africa to East Africa and the Indian Ocean. This would ultimately fail, but they were happy to have set up a colony, since it would be a boost to national ego, and prevent the British or French from taking it instead. They set up several ports on the coast and slowly began pushing inland. They established a capital at Yaoundé in the late 1880s, which continues to act as the capital of the country today. The Germans allowed trading companies and corporations to run most of the colony. These companies began setting up plantations where banana, rubber, palm oil, coca, and coffee would all be farmed and produced, which still today, to varying degrees, are very important in the Cameroonian economy. Often forced labor was used and African tribes who resisted would be brutally crushed. German colonial policy was often notorious for using brutal crackdowns to establish and hold their authority. They also would, to a certain extent, bring in a small number of German settlers and attempted to educate the local population in missionary schools to solidify their control. Ultimately, all of these efforts would be in vain. German influence in the country today, compared to that of the French or British, is very limited. And it seems the most long-lasting impact they had on Cameroon was giving the country its name, Cameroon. Cameroon would be taken away from the Germans in World War I. A couple of weeks after war was declared in 1914, French and British troops began conducting border raids into the country. While the Germans initially were able to hold off the invading force and beat them in several battles, they were outnumbered, almost entirely surrounded by enemy territory, and unable to resupply their forces. By March 1916, the Germans were forced to flee into neutral Spanish Guinea. At war's end, parts of the eastern and northern regions were incorporated into other French colonies, while the rest was divided between 3 League of Nations mandates. These mandates essentially were just new colonies, but there was French Cameroon, controlled by, of course, the French, and northern and southern Cameroons, which were both controlled by the British. British and French Cameroon would largely differ from each other due to the different colonial policies of the British and French. The French believed in a civilizing mission, and wanted to assimilate the Cameroonians into wider French culture. French legal laws were brought over, and French culture was considered supreme. Africans who assimilated into French culture could speak French, and were Western educated were considered above Africans who refused to assimilate. At first, few would assimilate into French society. Traditional African chiefs weren't entirely wiped out, but they were considered subordinate to French colonial officers who administered the colony in a system that Mufor Atanga described in his book, The Anglophone Cameroon Predicament, as, quote, centralized, hierarchical, and uniform. Atanga is also the main source I used for this episode. I read his book in college for a paper, and his book overall presents a deep dive into the division between Anglophone and Francophone Cameroon. It's a little outdated since it was released in 2011, but overall still a very interesting source. British Cameroons, on the other hand, was run under the pretense of self-governance, and so a certain degree of autonomy was given to the Africans. British officers were supposed to act more as advisors to local chiefs rather than directly lording over them. The British, importantly, treated its new Cameroonian territory as an extension of its Nigerian territory, meaning they were considered one and the same. This had Cameroon as almost a colony of the Nigerian colony, with migrants from Igbo land entering into the region, while colonial authorities in Nigeria paid little mind to its new territory, leaving it underdeveloped. This led southern Cameroons to begin to develop a distrust towards the Nigerians. After World War II, both British and French Cameroon would begin to see increased autonomy, as France and Britain, exhausted from war, began to face greater demands from their colonized people for freedom. In French Cameroon, the French began taking steps to educate the Cameroonian population, along with taking greater steps to build up the colony's infrastructure, and just generally invested more in the colony. I couldn't find a clear answer why the French decided to do this, but I suspect it may have had something to do with the fact that Cameroon was originally a League of Nations mandate, which was supposed to have some higher standard of governance, but I just don't 100% know. French Cameroon would, however, have to deal with insurrection from Cameroonian nationalists. These nationalists found a home in the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon, or UPC. The UPC was very sympathetic towards Marxism, and the French, fearing Cameroon might fall to communism, began cracking down on the UPC. The UPC took to the jungles and mountains of southern Cameroon and launched a guerrilla war. This guerrilla war, compared to other anti-colonial conflicts in Algeria and Vietnam, is seldom talked about. The French, it seems, were able to weaken the rebels by giving greater self-governance to the Cameroonian elites that aligned with them, destroying villages that worked with the UPC, and preventing the UPC from reaching an international audience. However, the UPC were partially able to reach southern Cameroons, where some of its members were able to flee. They partially encouraged elites in southern Cameroons to begin to embrace a return to a single Cameroon. Many in southern Cameroons hoped that by joining their francophone counterparts, they might escape being under the Igbos. Several political parties were formed, and increased self-governance was granted to British Cameroons. By the mid-50s, it was clear that independence would come in Cameroon, but it was debated who they should be independent with. French Cameroon would become independent in 1960 under a pro-French government, so it really was a debate if they should join Nigeria or Cameroon. British Cameroon becoming independent by itself was rejected by the British and the UN, since they believed the region wouldn't be economically self-sufficient. In 1961, a referendum was held in both northern and southern Cameroons over if the territory should remain with Nigeria or join francophone-speaking Cameroon. Southern Cameroons, wanting more freedom from Nigeria, voted for reunification, while northern Cameroons, which experienced less migration and were majority Muslim, joined with Nigeria. A constitutional convention was held at Fumban to determine the structure of the new Cameroonian state. Francophone Cameroon was united under its president, Amadou Ahidjo, a politician from northern Cameroon, but Anglophone Cameroon was divided. The many political elites that attended squabbled among each other and failed to present a united front to articulate the demands and wants of Anglophone Cameroon. While a federation was agreed upon, Francophone Cameroon left the conference as the dominant player, and with Ahidjo as president. It's interesting to note that Cameroon became independent, but Cameroonian nationalists didn't actually win independence. The UPC weren't a part of the new state. The UPC didn't stop their insurgency when Cameroon became independent, and continued to fight against the new Cameroonian state for another 4 years. They saw Ahidjo as being controlled by France. And to a certain extent, it's hard to argue against this point. Cameroon, both then and today, is very close to France. Business-wise, many French companies operate in the country. Trade agreements between the two heavily favor the French. Much of Cameroon's debts are tied up in France itself, and even in 1971, most officers in the Cameroonian army were still Frenchmen, and today they are closely connected militarily. This close relationship with France has always been a bit controversial, and has helped shape the political ruling class in Yaoundé. Ahidjo, as the first president of Cameroon, really set the tone for the country's course. Ahidjo's ideology was officially called planned liberalism. He believed in state control of major industries, but he also favored a market economy, foreign investment, and sided geopolitically with France and the West. While initially Cameroon would be a federation, and was in some sense a multi-party democracy, Ahidjo quickly began banning or absorbing rival political parties, until by 1966, the Cameroonian National Union, or CNU, was the only party allowed. The federation was abolished in 1972, further consolidating Ahidjo's power. Ahidjo ultimately ruled as a strongman, cracking down on any movement who opposed him, while offering money and power to those loyal to him. Ahidjo stepped down as president in 1982 due to health reasons, letting Paul Biya become the second president of Cameroon. Biya, who was prime minister from 1975 to 1982, was a southerner, unlike Ahidjo. Despite this, Biya and Ahidjo started off as allies to each other, with Biya serving as president while Ahidjo led the CNU. However, in 1983, while Ahidjo was away in France, Biya began removing close allies of Ahidjo, and started replacing them with his own men. Biya foiled an alleged coup attempt by Ahidjo in early 1984, briefly fought off rebels in the capital, and Biya officially consolidated his hold on the country. Biya since 1984 has dominated the country, ruling it for around 40 years. The differences between Ahidjo and Biya are in some ways barely noticeable, and in other ways very distinct. The CNU was reformed into the Cameroonian People's Democratic Movement, or CPDM. Biya started giving greater influence and power to members of his ethnic group, the Betis. He did institute a quota system where people from all over the country could get into positions of power. However, he often reserved the top positions for those of the Beti people group. Biya switched from planned liberalism to his new hype spin on liberalism, communal liberalism. Ultimately, Biya would prove to embrace privatization and deregulation in the economy more, but Biya still kept many of the features of the Ahidjo years. Both Ahidjo and Biya ruled via nationalism, patriotism, loyalty to France, and cracking down on those who opposed them. Anglophone Cameroon, while it wasn't politically significant throughout both the Ahidjo and Biya's early years, was changing. Anglophones began experiencing more pressure to assimilate into Francophone Cameroon. While Cameroon was officially bilingual, France was placed as more important than English. The French school system was imported to the Anglophone regions, and French teachers were brought into English-speaking areas and taught almost entirely in French. Most of the media in Cameroon was presented in French. For a couple of examples, the Cameroon Tribute, a government newspaper, published 5 times a week in French, while only 2 times a week in English. Only 18.2% of all programs shown on Cameroonian TV were in English, and when an American sitcom was shown in English, the Cameroonian TV Authority had to apologize. I mean, don't get me wrong, American sitcoms suck, but apologizing just for showing them in English is a bit harsh. Another problem Anglophone Cameroonians had to deal with was they were often encouraged to leave their territory and move to Francophone regions, where they'd have to speak French. While rubber, oil, and tea production increased after independence, banana exports, the backbone of the southern Cameroon's economy in colonial times, began to dramatically decrease. English speakers were forced to move to Francophone regions for work, or potentially go into poverty. Anglophone Cameroons also struggled to get government documents, since if you wanted to get even a small piece of paperwork, you'd have to travel to Yaoundé and hassle with bureaucrats who may not even speak your language. Anglophone elites largely let the system go on and failed to raise these issues with their Francophone superiors, since they personally could survive in the current system, so saw little incentive to fight for their communities. This also would be true for elites all around Cameroon, since the one-party state had very little accountability for the ruling politicians. This would sort of change in the 90s. An economic recession forced Biya to open up, and in 1992, multi-party elections were held in the country. Biya won with only 40% of the vote, but because the opposition was divided, he managed to keep his hold on power. Biya quickly returned to his more authoritarian methods, but allowing the opposition to exist in the country. Right now, the 2 largest legal opposition parties are the UNDP, a party formed from former Ahidjo allies and northerners, and the SDF, which is a social democratic party basing its support base in the Anglophone regions. However, the CPDM wins almost all elections in the country, with over 70% of the vote. While Cameroon was at first praised for being one of the more peaceful countries in Africa, fun fact while researching, I found a documentary from 2003 called Cameroon: The Secret of Peace. This image started to crumble in the 90s. First off, Cameroon would have a territorial dispute with Nigeria over the Bakassi Peninsula. This peninsula was claimed by Cameroon but was officially under Nigerian control. Border clashes began with both sides almost going to full-on war. In 2002, the International Court of Justice ruled that Cameroon should control the peninsula, which made the Cameroonian side very happy. However, among the people living on the peninsula, they weren't very excited to have to swap countries, and several armed groups began to spring up to oppose their new Cameroonian rulers. Since 2006, there have been violent clashes between the Cameroonian military and separatists hoping to break free from Cameroon. While it seems the main phase of the conflict is over, there still are violent clashes in Bakassi. Since 2014, Cameroon's north has seen violence. While Boko Haram, an Islamist terrorist group, was founded and mostly based in Nigeria, it had begun in 2014 turning to more and more violent and extreme tactics, destabilizing the region, and started to move into neighboring countries all around Lake Chad, even taking a couple of towns in Cameroon. Cameroon, along with Niger, Chad, and Nigeria, all began to coordinate to try to take down Boko Haram, launching major offensives against the group. Boko Haram today is nowhere near as powerful as they were in 2014, however, they do still exist, and clashes break out between them and the military pretty frequently. The latest attack I could find was on August 8th, when Boko Haram militants raided several towns in Cameroon's north. However, probably the biggest conflict going on in Cameroon right now is the Anglophone crisis. Since the 90s, there's been several groups advocating for Anglophone Cameroon to break away from the rest of the country, arguing that Francophones discriminate against them and the current borders are the legacy of colonialism. In 2016, protests broke out over the appointment of Francophone judges in the Anglophone regions. The government attempted to crack down on the protesters, but instead of stamping out the protest, violence just grew. By October of 2017, armed groups began calling for the independence of the Anglophone regions, or Ambazonia, and an all-out guerrilla war began. A government in exile of Ambazonia was set up, which attempted to serve as the head of the Anglophone resistance. While the government controls the major cities, a large chunk of the rural villages are under separatist control, and both sides have took to raiding each other, hoping to wear the other down. War crimes and innocents being killed have been perpetuated by both sides, with the Cameroonian government wiping out whole villages and sending civilians into minefields, while the separatists have been accused of forcing the shutdown of schools, since they accuse the schools of trying to assimilate the Anglophones, and of extorting people in the areas they control. The Ambazonia conflict is also complicated by the fact that the Ambazonian separatists aren't really united. Right now, there are 3 people who all claim to be the legitimate president of Ambazonia. This makes it both difficult for Ambazonian separatists to organize and gain legitimacy, either internationally or on the ground, but also makes it difficult for the Cameroonian government to negotiate and stop the violence, since instead of negotiating with one president, they instead have to negotiate with 3. Overall, the conflict has disrupted normal life in the Anglophone regions. While there is a sense that if Cameroon returned to a federation, and the federal government wasn't so heavy-handed, many Anglophones would be happy and could stop the violence. Cameroon, with the backing of other African states and France, have opposed any such move. Violence, it seems, will likely continue, with the death toll in the thousands right now and around 1 million people displaced. Even just a day before I recorded this, there were reports of separatists attacking a bus, killing 6. On a lighter note, Ambazonia is not recognized by any government in the world, but there is actually a Brazilian town that recognizes them, strangely. Town councilors met with one of the disputed presidents and supported their right to self-determination. It's unlikely this one Brazilian town really has a massive impact on the Anglophone conflict, but still interesting. Besides conflicts in the country, Cameroon has also had to deal with corruption, poverty, authoritarianism, and Lake Chad, a very important part in everyday life for many people in the north, drying up. It does admittedly, though, have a growing economy, a pretty high literacy rate compared to other countries in Africa, and is noted for very impressive African architecture in the capital. So why does Cameroon exist? Cameroon was formed and shaped by German, English, and French colonialism. It's very unique in the fact that it had 2 very different colonial models put together into one country. I don't think conflict between Anglophones and Francophones is the only driving force in Cameroonian history, but I do think it's one of the main drivers of it. Whether these 2 groups will find a way to live together, or ultimately part and go their separate ways, remains to be seen. Up next, we go to Canada. Prepare for geographic diversity, colonization, the French and British, and a big... Hey, wait, that's what I said last time! So yeah, thanks for listening, hope you enjoyed. So up next, I will work on a episode on Israeli politics. I should be getting help for that one. Someone said that they were going to help me, and then I also got in contact with one of the political parties, and they said that they would contact me in a couple weeks, so maybe they'll help me out, but we'll see. And then after that, I will work on Irish political parties, and then I will work on the history of Canada. That'll be a big one, so presumably it'll be a while before that's out. Yeah, if you want, you can email me at whydocountriesexist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I used for this episode are 52 Documentaries documentary, Cameroon, the most peaceful country of Africa, All Africa articles, Cameroon Boko Haram launches raids, Mulfor Atanga's book, The Anglophone Cameroon Predicament, and again, I would really recommend this one, Buari City Council's press release on Ambazonia, Caspian Report's video, Cameroon is being torn apart by language, DW's video on Mengal Baldola, and is the Biya political dynasty taking shape in Cameroon, France 24's video, Cameroon elections, Paul Biya, the invisible candidate, Geography Now's video on Cameroon, Juan Afrique, something like that, article, Cameroon, France, Everything is Played Out by Echelle Mabembe, Mr. History's video on Cameroon, Professor James Kerr-Lindsay's video on Ambazonia, and Wikipedia.